Please welcome developer advocate from Google, Brian Kanish.
Thank you, everyone. It's great to be here. So as that voice in the sky just said, I'm a developer advocate at Google based in San Francisco and Mountain View. And I work on primarily Google Chrome and HTML5, and I've tried to combine those two things into this talk. So I'm going to be talking about how to develop advanced Google Chrome extensions with HTML5, as well as some of the other new and experimental features that are built into Google Chrome. So I packed a lot of content into this deck, which I might not get to all of it. If I miss some stuff or you want to take a look at the slides afterwards, you can do so at jump/CRX201. That's j.mp/CRX201. And if you want to get in touch with me afterwards, I believe we're going to have office hours. You can also ping me on Twitter at twitter.com/bugle, B-Y-O-O-G-L-E. I'll show these links at the end of the deck as well. So specifically what I'm going to be talking about is I'm going to do a quick recap of general extension development in case any of you haven't built extensions before. But I'm going to go through this really quickly because I think most of you probably have at least a little bit of experience with extensions, and I don't want to bore you. After that, I'll go through a tour of different features that you can add to your extensions, and I'll show you snippets of code for how you can put them into your extensions that you're building. I'll start with some new features that are built into Google Chrome. Then I'll talk about a couple of the experimental APIs that we have. Next, I'll get to the HTML5 bit and show you how to do a specific HTML5 integration with an extension. I'll also be mentioning HTML5 at a couple other points in this presentation. And finally, time permitting, I'll talk about an advanced technique for communicating within your extension. So let's start with the basics. So we designed the extension system. Our big philosophy behind it was that we wanted to make it so that if you're a web developer, if you already know how to create web pages, creating extensions is going to be really easy. You can use the same skills that you have for developing web pages on extensions. And I think that philosophy has been proven out by the fact that we launched the extension system just about 3 months ago, and we already have more than 3,000 extensions that have been built and put into our gallery. So extensions are made entirely of standard web technologies, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and so forth. The same development process that you use for creating a web page is applicable to extensions. So you pop open your files in a text editor, manipulate them, and then just reload your extension, and you can see the changes that you've made instantly. In the same way, the debugging process is very similar. If you guys have used the developer tools in Chrome at all, you can use them equally with extensions as you can with web pages. And finally, once you're done building your extension, you take the directory where you have all your components, and it just gets zipped up, and you can ship it off to users. And it's just a regular zip file with a little signature added to it. So besides being just plain old web pages, extensions aren't exactly web pages. There's a little more to them. And in particular, they have some additional UI surfaces that they can plug into that regular web pages cannot. So the first one is a browser action, which I have a little icon of here. A browser action is a small 19 by 19 pixel icon that appears in the Chrome toolbar, and it appears on all of a user's tabs. It can be have some text on top of it, up to 4 characters. In this case, you see an email notifier that has a count of the user's inbox. Next, we have a page action, which is a similarly sized icon, except it appears in the Chrome Omnibox, which is where you type URLs and search queries into. And unlike a browser action, it can be toggled on and off per each tab, so it doesn't necessarily have to appear on all of the user's tabs. And finally, the third UI surface that we have is content scripts, which are similar to Greasemonkey or user scripts and let you inject arbitrary JavaScript and CSS into any matching web page. Next, there are a couple special components to extensions that you generally wouldn't be working with a regular website. The first is a manifest file, which is a JSON formatted metadata that describes the extension. Has things like the extension's name, description, pointers to the different icons for the extension system to use. It also describes the permissions that it's going to request from the user at the time the user installs the extension. And finally, it has pointers to all the other components of the extension. And the second special component that an extension can have is a background page, which is a hidden web page that the user doesn't see. And it runs for the entire life of the extension. And this lets you do things like coordinate tasks between the different components in your extension, as well as manage state. Finally, there are a few privileged APIs that extensions can plug into that a regular web page can't. The first is Chrome.BrowserAction, and this obviously lets you manipulate those browser actions that we looked at before. The same is true of Chrome.PageAction. Then we have Chrome.Extension, which is a utility class. Primarily, it has methods and objects for doing message passing between the different components of your extension. And then there are 3 APIs for manipulating the browser itself. Chrome.Windows lets you do operations on Windows. Chrome.Tabs lets you do operations on tabs. And finally, Chrome.Bookmarks lets you manipulate the user's bookmark tree. So that's my quick intro to extensions. If you want a full talk on this, you can go to jump.crxbasic. So let's talk about some new features that are built into the extension system. First, I'm going to be talking about an options page. So we actually, options pages predate the launch of extensions in the stable build of Chrome, but we didn't get to talk about them in our last round of Chrome extension talks, so I want to mention this. So as you're making a more complex extension, we found that you really need to be able to let the user configure the experience, and you can do that with an options page. You can see in this case here, where my mouse is, this particular extension has an options page. Clicking on that just points to a free-form HTML page. And since the page is free-form, the option page, there are some considerations when you're building an option page. The first is persistence, how you're going to keep track of the configuration data that the user inputs. One way to do it is with local storage. And here's the first place where I'm going to talk about HTML5. And let me preface this with the caveat that I'm going to mention a bunch of stuff and call it HTML5. And if you guys went to Mike Smith's talk earlier, he was much more precise about what is actually HTML5. So when I'm referring to HTML5, I'm just talking about generally the next generation of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, not specifically what's in the HTML5 spec. And local storage is an example that's not actually in the HTML5 spec, but it lets you store key value pairs in an easy way with a JavaScript API. Next, we have recently in the latest stable build of Chrome, we have the Web SQL Database API implemented. So if you want to do some more full-fledged SQL stuff in your extensions, you can do that with this API. And finally, for storing user settings, you can choose none of the above. So if you're only interested in keeping track of the settings that the user inputs for the current session, you don't have to store them in a longer-term way. Next, once you actually have the user's option data, you have to get it to the rest of your components of the browser, and you do that with some extension communication. The first thing that you can do is message passing, and especially in the case where you're not persisting the user's data, you're going to need to pass a message from your option page to other components in your extension that are actually going to use that data. And the second option for getting the user's data options from the option page to the rest of your extension is to just use a control loop. So you can periodically poll to see what the settings are, and that's especially true if you're using local storage or a web SQL database. So with that, let's take a look at a sample of this. So here I'm going to install that Gmail checker. And after I install this, it's not going to find my account. But if I pop over to the extension management page, I can open up the option page. And I'm going to take out this domain that's set in here, which is my work account. And I'm just going to query for my personal account. And now it is able to find my email account, and it displays it up here in the browser. So let's look at how that's actually implemented. So we'll start by looking at the manifest file. And again, as I mentioned, let me make this font a little bit bigger. That's big enough here for you guys? Yeah. So in the manifest file, we are going to have a options page field right here. And that's going to point to an HTML file. In this case, it's called options.html. And that's all there is to actually installing an options page. Then let's take a look at our options file. I think I'm going to make this a little bit smaller because it's kind of big on my screen. Okay. So in our options file, we just have some basic HTML that's painting that screen that we took a look at before, and it has a single input field here, which goes down to here. There's an event handler for when data is actually inputted into that field, this make dirty function. So when we take a look at that, you can see that this function simply toggles the state of the save button. So in this case, when data is entered, it'll toggle it from the ghosted state to the unghosted state. And then when the save button is pressed, which is down here, we have another event handler that calls the save function. And in this particular function, uses local storage, that first option that I mentioned. So it simply sets a key of custom domain to the value of that input box. So now this user setting of this domain is saved into that key. And then elsewhere in the extension, it can simply go ahead and use it. So this extension uses a background page. And if we take a look, there's at various points, it just calls out to local storage.custom domain. And that's all there is to getting that setting from an options page to the rest of the extension. So next, I'm going to talk about internationalization, which is a feature that we rolled out about 2 months ago. We currently support in the extension system 55 different languages, which means that if you're using internationalization, you can localize your extension in up to 55 different languages, provide translations in those languages. And the extension gallery itself supports 42 different languages. It's translated into 42 different languages. And I believe that accounts for over 99% of the world's population. So by localizing your extensions, you have the opportunity to get your extension to potentially a lot more users. As far as implementing internationalization, so it's going to be a little hairy when I just describe this here, but when we actually look at code, you'll see that it's pretty simple and straightforward. The first thing, if you're internationalizing your extension, is that in your manifest file, you need to provide a default locale field. And the way the extension system works is that it looks for a translation that matches one of the user's language settings, but if it can't find anything, it's going to default to this locale that you specify. Next, in your manifest file, you're going to use these message macros, and where the star is here, you would provide variable names, and they would be translated by the extension system when the extension actually runs. Likewise, in your JavaScript, you can make calls out to chrome.i18 and get message and provide text strings that will be replaced in the correct language. Next, in your extension directory, you're going to provide a underscore locales directory. And under that, you're going to have subdirectories that have language codes, and this is where your actual translations are held. So for example, if you were providing a Japanese translation, you would have a subdirectory called JA. Finally, in each of these subdirectories, you have messages.json files, which is where your actual translations live. So let's look at an example of that. So this is a very simple extension, and when I click on it, it's going to say left-click to list accept languages in English. And when I left-click on that, it's going to list the accept languages that I have set in my browser. In this case, English with a US modifier and plain English. So now I'm going to run this same extension under a different browser profile, which happens to be set in Spanish. And you'll see that when I click on this now, it's going to be translated into Spanish. I have no idea what this says, but I assume it's the same thing that I had up before. And when I left-click on this, it's going to list my accept languages again, but this time it'll be Spanish languages. So let's take a look at how that's implemented. First, we'll start with our manifest file again. And here we have that default locale field. And in this case, it's US English. And we have a bunch of these message macros. This one's called Chrome _extension _name. Here's one for the Chrome description. Next, let's take a look at our pop-up file. And in our JavaScript here, we're going to have some calls to this getMessage method. And this is making, passing in a variable of click here. Here's another one that passes in a variable of Chrome accept languages. And there's a second parameter there as well, which I'll talk about in a second. All right, so then in our extension directory, we have this _locales directory, and then we're providing 3 translations in English, Spanish, and I believe that third one is Serbian. So if we take a look in the English directory and open up our messages file, you can see here we have a bunch of translations. Here is those variable names that we're passing in, Chrome _extension _name. Here's the description. And if we look a little further down, so those are pretty straightforward ones. If we look a little bit further down, we have a more complex one here, which contains some placeholders. And these are variables that are surrounded with $signs. Here's one called Chrome. Here's one called languages. In the first instance, the one called Chrome, we're doing a straightforward replacement. So here's that Chrome variable, and it's being replaced by content Chrome. So it just takes, and the variable names are not case sensitive, by the way. So it'll just take this variable and pop in Chrome there. But in the second case, we're doing something a little more complicated. So instead of putting a literal string in there, we have this, this one variable. And what that's doing is if we go back to that getMessage call, that second parameter is being dynamically passed in. And if we look a little further up in the code here, oops, cut out there, language is being generated by this getAccept languages method. So that's getting the languages that the client is sending as the user's accept languages, and it's just passing it back into that translation, so it's provided dynamically. All right, so that covers it for the new features. Next, I'm going to be talking about the 2 experimental APIs that we have in the extension system, and the way that so we rolled out the extension system with a fairly narrow set of APIs because we want to be very careful about what we roll out because we never want to, we want to try very hard to never break extensions. And so the way we're rolling out new APIs is that we roll them out as experimental so we can play around with them as well as developers, and we can get feedback from developers, and you can see what they look like as they're taking shape. So the first experimental API that we have is the history API. It lets you completely manipulate the user's history, and eventually it will let you replace the default Chrome history page that we're looking at here. So we currently have an override page for the new tabs window. You can override the default new tab page. Eventually you'll be able to do the same with the history page. But right now you can just manipulate the underlying data. So there are a set of requirements when you're using an experimental API. The first is that you have to use a dev channel build. Experimental APIs are only available in the dev channel. Next is that you have to run the browser under a specific flag, which is called Enable Experimental Extension APIs. Then in your manifest file, you have to specify an experimental permission. And finally, you can't submit experimental extensions with experimental APIs to the gallery. Eventually, when these APIs are no longer experimental, you'll of course be able to submit them. So as far as implementation of the history API, the namespace that it's under is chrome.experimental.history. And it lets you do all the basic CRUD operations on a user history. So that's create, read, update, and delete. So let's take a look at an example of that. So this is a little sample that I call Pseudo Incognito because it's going to sort of emulate incognito mode in a regular browser window. So if I open a new tab here, let me pop open my history first. So we see that's what I have in my history. If I open a new tab, and I'm going to go to google.com, and if I reload my history, that should show up right there. Now, I'm going to install this extension. Oh, that's not good. Let's try that again. All right, we're going to have to do some debugging on the fly here. Enable experimental extension APIs. Looks okay to me. All right, I guess I'm not going to get to show you this one. Well, if we have time at the end, I'll come back to this, but I'll show you the code anyhow. It's quite simple. So we have a manifest file, and we're specifying this experimental permission, and this is what's actually triggering that error, but I'm not sure why, because it was working 5 minutes ago, but in any case, we'll figure it out later. And we just have a simple background page. This background page has a listener installed for when a tab is loaded. So as any tab is loading, it makes a call out to chrome.experimental.history, delete URL, and it simply takes the tab URL and deletes it out of the history. So again, if we have a bunch of time left at the end, I'll come back and try to do some more debugging on this. Next, we have a processes API. So this one is a lot less baked than the history API. And I'm guessing when I show you this sample, it's probably not going to work either, but we'll give it a shot anyhow. So the processes API, similar to the history API, has the same prerequisites that any experimental API does. So you have to be using a dev channel build. Again, use this, this experimental flag, which you saw in my properties. Requires the experimental permission in your manifest file. And you can't submit, again, these extensions to the gallery. So as far as implementation, the namespace for this API is chrome.experimental.processes. And CRUD doesn't totally make sense in the sense of processes. It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to create or update processes, but you can currently read processes. And we actually only have, I mentioned it's not as fully baked as the history API. We only have one method and one object currently implemented. So you can currently read processes, but you can't delete or terminate them yet, but that will be coming. All right, let's give this a shot. I have an idea of what might be wrong. I'm going to try it anyway. Okay. I think it's this one. Dang it. Sorry about that. Give this one more shot. It's not going to cooperate with it. But I'll show you the code for this anyhow. So we're going to start with our manifest file. And it's going to look pretty similar to what we saw in with the history example. We have this experimental permission. Next, we'll take our pop-up file. And I should describe this. So this extension, what it does is it simply finds the process that the tab is currently running under and lists out if there are any other tabs running under that process. So it has an init function, and it iterates through all the windows and tabs to find the selected window. There's actually a little bit easier way to do this, but this happens to only be 2 lines of code. And then it makes a call out to this one function that I mentioned is implemented, which is get process for tab. And that takes a tab ID, in this case the selected tab, and it has a callback function, which is going to actually do some outputting to the pop-up file. So here it will, it's going to print out the process ID of the tab, and then underneath that it'll find all the different tabs that are running in that process and print them out as well. All right, now let's talk about some HTML5. So I touched on some HTML5 concepts already with local storage and web SQL databases. Again, here I'm going to be talking primarily about an HTML5 feature that's not really HTML5, desktop notifications. The reason I picked desktop notifications to show is that so desktop notifications actually require a little more integration work to work in extensions, whereas most of the other HTML5 features can be, you can add them pretty seamlessly to your extensions. So before I talk about desktop notifications specifically, I just want to give a quick look at some of the HTML5 features that are already implemented in the stable version of Google Chrome, and you can just use, like I mentioned, seamlessly in your extensions. The first is the canvas tag, which lets you paint 2D images in your extensions. Audio and video tags are also implemented to let you natively do audio and video. Web fonts is a really important one. So I think, until recently, there were really only 9 or so web-safe fonts that you could use, not including the couple of wingding type of ones. So web fonts is actually something that's been around for quite a while. It dates back to CSS2, so it's been around for more than 2 years, but now modern browsers are starting to implement the much more standard true type fonts. So they're much more valuable. So this lets you do, you can put nice fonts in your extensions and not have to worry that some users won't be able to see them. You can also do visual filters, so do things like drop shadows on images. Transitions and animations are possible. In pure CSS, no JavaScript required. We talked about ways of persisting data already, local storage, web SQL databases. And then we have desktop notifications. So there's a lot more than to HTML type of features that are implemented in Google Chrome that I haven't mentioned here. And you can get the full list of them. Mike actually pointed to this URL as well in his presentation, if you saw that, at jump/CR/HTML5. So now let's talk about desktop notifications specifically. So I like to refer to notifications as the 4th UI surface in Chrome extensions. So I mentioned in that little intro bit the 3 other UI surfaces that are possible. We have browser actions, page actions, and content scripts. And notifications give you a 4th way to present UI to a user. And what they let you do that the other components don't let you do is push information to a user. So rather than the user having to somehow pull information by, say, clicking on a browser action or page action, you can display a dialog and the user give you the user information that way. So it's great for things like news or alerts. And the other nice thing about desktop notifications is that unlike alert dialogues, they're non-modal, which means that they don't require the user to actually take some action on them immediately. They can ignore them for a while and then come back and look at them later. So in order to implement notifications, and this is the bit of extra work that I mentioned before, you have to add this notifications permission to your manifest file. You actually, to be more specific, don't have to do this. You can just use the methods that are provided by the notifications API, but it's a lot more seamless in an extension when you add this notifications permission, because then you don't have to explicitly ask the user to show them notifications. You just ask them one time at install time. The namespace for this API is WebKit notifications, because this is actually built into WebKit, not exclusively in Google Chrome. So there are methods for creating both text and HTML notifications, and there are methods for showing and hiding those notifications. So let's take a look at a sample of that, and hopefully this will cooperate. And you see here we have a notification that pops up immediately. This notification sample is very simple. It's just going to show by default every minute the same notification over and over again. So I'm just going to leave this running so you can see that. And these are called desktop notifications, not exclusively browser notifications. So if I minimize all this stuff, you'll see that they still appear on my desktop. So let's take a look at how that's implemented. We'll start with our manifest file. And here we have that notifications permission. Next, we have a background page, which is where the actual work happens. And here we're just doing a bunch of settings. So this is where the frequency is set, whether or not to actually show notifications, and whether this initialization function has run. So I'm actually going to close this because it's in my way of showing you code. And then we're testing for whether notifications are supported. If they are, and the extension is activated, we immediately show the notification. And then here we basically have a while loop that will continue showing notifications while the extension is activated. And here's another example of using local storage for maintaining user option data. And you can see the way this one works is by, this falls under the control loop example. So it just periodically checks, it'll keep rechecking this local storage to see whether the extension is still activated and if the frequency has been changed by the user. And so we have this show function here, which points to this function up here. And this simply creates a notification. There we go. And it's going to pass in, this happens to be a text notification. So it's going to pass in an icon for the notification, which is that image that you see. And it'll pass in a headline string and a body string. And then it just makes a call out to the show function, which pops up the notification. So I'm going to close these things. You can see how they work, but they get annoying if I leave them open. And I'm going to disable this extension. All right, so it looks like we still have some time. So the last bit I'm going to talk about is one advanced technique that you can put into your extensions. And if you've already built extensions, you probably have done at least some of this to a certain extent. So this is going to be talking about how you communicate within your extension to the other components of your extension. So as your extension gets more complex, you add more components, it becomes increasingly necessary to have them talking to each other. So the scenario gets a little bit complex because we made it such that content scripts work differently than all the other components in an extension. And the reason that we did this is because we were concerned about content scripts potentially getting compromised. We weren't sure in the wild what kind of, under what kind of circumstances they might get compromised. So we limited the what access to APIs content scripts have. So when you're communicating from any other component except the content script to a background page, the scenario is pretty straightforward. So that would be a browser action, page action, options page, or any other page that's bundled into your extension. You can simply make a call out to this method chrome.extension.getBackgroundPage. And once you have this object, you can call methods in a background page directly or access variables that way. Likewise, if you're going from a background page to any of those other extension components, there's a variety of methods for actually getting references to those components. The first is chrome.extension.getExtensionTabs, which will give you an array of all the extension tabs in all the extension components. Then you can just get all in a specific window, passing in a window ID and get all the components there. Then to get even more specific, you can pass in a specific tab ID, and that'll give you a reference to that, the extension components in that tab. And finally, you can just get the selected, the components from the selected extension tab. So the situation becomes more complex when you're dealing with a content script. So there's actually, we started out with just having a single way of doing this, but we found that it was a bit complex, so we added a simpler way. So there are now two ways of communicating from content scripts to background pages and vice versa. The first that I'll cover is that simpler way. So this lets you send a one-time message, and you do that with these methods, chrome.extension.sendRequest and chrome.extension onRequest.addListener. So that sendRequest method lives in your content script. The onRequest listener lives in your background page. Then we have the sort of longer-lived way, which lets you open up a port from your content script to your background page and send messages repeatedly. So this is for sending, if you're doing repeated message sending more than one message, you might use this method. And you do so in a similar way by using this connect method and adding a listener with the onConnect method in the background page. So the situation is similar if you're going the other way around from a background page to a content script. There are similar methods. The only difference here is that we're working under the tabs namespace when we're going from the background page to the content script, but otherwise these method calls are the same. And likewise, when we're going with the longer-lived version, we have similarly named methods, except going from the background page to a content script comes under the tabs API. So let's quickly look at an example of this. So I'm going to open up Google News here. And what this extension does is that when you turn it on and you mouse over links on any page, it'll turn them into QR codes, which lets you scan them into your mobile phone. So you can see the extension now is in this ghosted off state. When I mouse over stuff, nothing is happening. But when I click on it to turn it on, now when I mouse over stuff, I'll get a QR code. I can also just randomly select some text, press Control-Q, and it'll give me a QR code as well. So this extension uses a pretty common pattern, which is that you want to have a browser action that acts as a button. And when you click that button, it toggles the extension on and off and communicates to the content script that way. So let's quickly look at how this works. First, we're going to look at our background page. So this background page happens to just point to a JS file, which I'll open up here. And we have an on-click event handler for the browser action. When the browser action is clicked on, we have this global variable isOn, and the state of that is toggled. So if the extension was off, it'll be turned on. If it was off, it would be if it's on, it would be turned off. Then we call this reload display function, which just paints the browser action appropriately, makes it ghosted or unghosted. And then we have a broadcast state function, which is where our actual message passing will happen. And here, we're getting all the tabs within the extension. So those are these lines here. And then for each tab, we call this connect method to open a port to the tab. And then we call post message to send the message, which comes in the form of key value pairs. Here we're sending this isOn state. And then finally, we'll take a look at our content script, which is actually doing the listening for this message. So here we're installing a listener, and it has a callback function that points to listen to state, which is up here. And here we're adding a listener to the message as well. And then likewise, like we did in the background page, we're setting this global variable of isOn to whatever the value was in that data message. And that's all there is to communicating from background page to a content script. So I have one more slide to go with some announcements. So if you guys are interested in working on extensions, which I assume that you are since you're here, there's a local developer community group here in Japan called Chromium-extensions.-Japan. And if you want to join this group, you can do so by going to jump/crxjp, and I encourage you to do so. The group is actually also having their first meetup, which is a tech talk at the Google Tokyo office on April 9th. So you can find out more information about that talk at jump/crxjp talk. There's also some slots still available for doing lightning talks if you have built an extension and you want to show the rest of the group how you implemented your extension. And finally, if you want to look at these slides some more, again, they're at jump/crx201. And you can get in touch with me either afterwards or on Twitter at twitter.com/BYOOGLE. And with that, I think we're just about out of time. I can probably take one question or two if there are any, because we have 2 minutes. If there are any questions out there. Okay, so I will be at office hours if you guys think of any questions or have anything that you want to talk to me about, any suggestions. And thank you very much for being here.